The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and coming snow across the Montana territory, and Caleb Ridgway stood at the edge of his property, watching the road like a man waiting for judgment. His ranch stretched out behind him, 300 acres of stubborn grass, a weathered barn, a house that had seen better decades, and cattle that didn't care much for human company, just like him. He wasn't a man given to nerves, but his hands found the brim of his hat anyway, turning it over and over while dust settled on his boots. The advertisement he'd placed in the Denver paper had been simple enough. Ranch cook needed. Room and board, honest work for honest pay. He'd expected someone older, maybe a widow looking to escape city noise, or a woman past her prime seeking quieter days. What he hadn't expected was to care one way or another. The stagecoach appeared as a dark spot against the pale horizon, growing larger as it rattled down the rutted road. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd built this life deliberately, solitary, predictable, free from the complications that came with depending on people. The cattle didn't talk back. The land didn't ask questions. And the silence never expected him to be anything other than what he was. But a man had to eat something besides burnt beans and questionable coffee. The stage pulled to a stop in a cloud of dust and horse sweat, and Caleb stepped forward, squinting against the afternoon sun. The driver, a grizzled man named Porter, who'd been running this route for 20 years, climbed down with the stiffness of someone who'd spent too many hours on hard wood. "Got your package, Ridgway?" Porter said, jerking his thumb toward the coach door. "Though I'd say she's more particular than most freight." The door opened before Caleb could respond. She stepped down carefully, one hand gathering her skirts, the other reaching back inside the coach. She was younger than he'd imagined, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a face that didn't waste energy on pleasantries. Her dress was plain, dark blue fabric that had seen wear but not neglect, and her movements carried the efficiency of someone who'd learned not to expect help. Caleb opened his mouth to introduce himself, to say something approximating welcome, but the words died in his throat. Because she turned back to the coach and lifted out a child. A boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with a tangle of light brown hair and a face smudged with travel dust. The child clung to her shoulder, peering at Caleb with eyes that were startlingly familiar, the same shade of gray-blue that looked back at him from his shaving mirror every morning. The world narrowed to that small face, and Caleb felt something cold and sharp lodge itself in his chest. "Mr. Ridgway?" The woman's voice cut through his paralysis. It was steady, almost flat, the tone of someone who'd stopped expecting warmth from strangers. "I'm May Turner. We corresponded about the cook position." Caleb's gaze snapped to her face, then back to the boy, then to her again. His mind raced through the fragments of her letters, careful handwriting, references from a boarding house in Billings, nothing that mentioned a child. Nothing that prepared him for this. "You didn't say anything about a boy," he said, and his voice came out rougher than intended. May's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a hardness that suggested she'd heard doubt before and learned to meet it head on. "You didn't ask. The advertisement said room and board for honest work. I can cook, clean, and manage a household. My son doesn't eat much, and he won't be trouble." "That's not—" Caleb started, but Porter's dry chuckle interrupted him. "World's full of surprises, ain't it?" The driver hauled 2 worn cases from the boot of the coach, setting them in the dust with more force than necessary. "I'll be heading back to town now, unless there's a problem?" May's chin lifted slightly, and Caleb recognized the gesture, pride holding its ground when everything else wanted to retreat. She was waiting for him to send her back, to declare the arrangement void, to prove that her careful journey had been for nothing. The boy shifted in her arms, and Caleb saw it then. A small birthmark just below the child's left ear, shaped like a crescent moon. Exactly like the one Caleb had carried since birth. Exactly like the one his father had borne, and his grandfather before him. The cold thing in his chest became ice. "No problem," Caleb heard himself say, though his voice sounded distant, disconnected from his body. "Porter, you can go." The driver tipped his hat, climbed back onto his perch, and snapped the reins. The stagecoach rumbled away, leaving May Turner and her son standing in the dust with their 2 cases and the weight of Caleb's stare. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. May set the boy down, keeping one hand on his shoulder as he pressed against her skirts, watching Caleb with those impossible eyes. "How old is he?" Caleb asked, and the question came out too sharp, too urgent. May's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 5 this past summer. 5 years. Caleb did the arithmetic automatically, counting backward through seasons and jobs, through towns he drifted through when the ranch felt too quiet and the whiskey and Billings felt too necessary. 5 years ago, he'd spent a week in that town, trying to outrun grief that had no name and filling the emptiness with things that left him emptier still. There'd been a woman, soft-spoken, working at the boarding house where he'd taken a room, brown hair, careful hands, a sadness in her eyes that matched his own. They'd shared one night, maybe two, moments that blurred together in memory, fogged by drink and deliberate forgetting. He'd left before dawn on the 3rd day, left money on the dresser, left everything behind like he always did. He looked at May now, really looked, and saw the echo of that woman beneath the layers of time and hardship, saw the way she held herself apart, expecting nothing, armored against disappointment. "May," he said slowly, testing the name, searching for recognition that refused to surface clearly. "May Turner." "I worked at the Riverside boarding house in Billings," she said quietly, confirming what he'd already begun to piece together. 6 years ago now. You stayed there for a few days. I don't expect you to remember." But he did remember, in fragments. Her voice in the darkness, the scent of lavender soap, the way she'd touched his face like she was memorizing something precious. And then nothing, because he'd made sure of nothing, because remembering meant feeling, and he'd spent years perfecting the art of not feeling anything at all. "The boy," Caleb said, and couldn't finish the question. "His name is Jonah." May's hand tightened on the child's shoulder, protective and definitive. "And before you ask, I didn't come here for anything except the work you advertised. I didn't know your name when I answered the posting. I recognized it only after we'd already arranged everything. If I'd known sooner," she paused, and something complicated crossed her face, "I probably would have come anyway. A woman with a child doesn't get many offers for honest work." Jonah, the boy, had been watching this exchange with the solemn attention of children who've learned to gauge adult moods for their own survival. Now he tugged on May's skirt, whispered something Caleb couldn't hear. May's expression softened slightly as she looked down at her son. "Soon," she murmured. "Let's get settled first." Caleb became aware that they were still standing in the open yard, that the sun was lowering toward the mountains, that he was staring at a child who carried his features like an accusation he couldn't deny. He reached for the cases, hefting them with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. "House is this way," he said, and started walking before May could respond. She followed, Jonah's small hand now clasped in hers, their footsteps quiet on the packed earth. Caleb led them across the yard, past the barn where his horse, Slate, watched their procession with mild equine interest, past the chicken coop where a few hens scratched at nothing in particular, toward the house that had sheltered only him for the past 8 years. The front door stuck slightly. It always did when the weather turned, and Caleb shouldered it open onto a space that suddenly felt smaller, more exposed. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting space all at once. An iron stove dominated one corner, a rough-hewn table commanded the center, and a few pieces of furniture that had come with the property occupied the rest. Everything was clean enough, functional enough, but unmistakably the domain of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. "Kitchen's yours to arrange however suits you," Caleb said, setting the cases down near the table. "Bedroom's through there." He gestured toward a door on the left. "That'll be yours and the boys. I'll take the loft." He nodded toward the ladder that led to the space above, where he'd been sleeping since he bought the place. May's gaze swept the room, assessing, calculating. "Where do you usually sleep?" "The loft works fine." "I'm not displacing you from your own bed, Mr. Ridgway. Jonah and I can manage in the loft." "No." The word came out harder than he intended. That's not suitable. You take the bedroom." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of debts and obligations that neither had asked for, but both were now bound to navigate. May's expression suggested she wanted to argue, but practicality won out. She nodded once, conceding the point. Jonah had already begun exploring, his small hands trailing over the edge of the table, his eyes wide as he took in this new space. He moved toward the window, standing on tiptoe to peer out at the barn and the land beyond. "He's quiet," Caleb observed, watching the boy. "He knows how to be." May's voice carried layers of meaning, pride in her son's adaptability, sorrow for the circumstances that required it. "We've moved often enough. He's learned." Caleb wanted to ask where they'd been, what roads had led her back into his orbit, whether the years between that night in Billings and this afternoon had been kind or cruel. But the questions felt too large, too intimate for this moment when they were still strangers occupying the same space through accident and biology. Instead, he moved toward the stove, began the familiar ritual of building a fire, needing something to do with his hands. "You'll want to start meals tomorrow. Tonight, there's beans and some jerky. Coffee's fresh enough." "I can manage something better than that if you've got flour and eggs," May said, already moving toward the shelves where he kept supplies, her assessment swift and professional. She found what she needed with the efficiency of someone who knew kitchens, who understood how to make something out of limited ingredients. "Jonah," she called softly, "come help Mama." The boy turned from the window, and as he crossed the room toward May, Caleb saw it again. The way he moved, a particular tilt of the head, the set of his small shoulders. It was like watching a ghost of himself at that age, a reflection that time had preserved and returned to him unexpected and undeniable. Jonah reached May's side, and she handed him a bowl, gave him some task that kept his hands busy. They worked together with practiced coordination, and Caleb realized he was watching something he'd never had, the easy intimacy of family, of people who knew each other's rhythms and moved accordingly. He retreated to the doorway, suddenly feeling like an intruder in his own home. Outside, the autumn evening was settling in, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. The cattle had moved toward the far pasture, dark shapes against darkening grass. Everything looked exactly as it always did. Everything had changed. Behind him, he heard May's quiet voice instructing Jonah, heard the boy's softer response, heard the clatter of pans and the ordinary sounds of a meal being prepared. Sounds he'd never allowed in this space, sounds that made the house feel different, smaller and larger at the same time. Caleb pulled out his tobacco, rolled a cigarette with fingers that had steadied, and lit it with a match struck against the doorframe. Smoke curled upward, dissipating in the wind. He'd spent years building a life that required nothing from anyone, a fortress of solitude that protected him from the mess of human connection. And now a woman and a child, his child, stood in his kitchen, shattering that carefully constructed isolation with nothing more than their presence. When May called him to the table 20 minutes later, he found she'd transformed his meager supplies into something that approximated a proper meal. Eggs scrambled with wild onions she must have spotted growing near the well, biscuits that were actually edible, coffee that didn't taste like punishment. She'd set 3 places and Jonah sat at one already, his legs swinging above the floor, watching Caleb with unguarded curiosity. They ate in near silence, the scrape of forks on tin plates the only conversation. Caleb caught himself stealing glances at the boy, at Jonah, noting the way he chewed thoughtfully, the serious expression he wore while eating, the careful way he held his fork. May had taught him manners, had given him structure despite whatever circumstances they'd endured. "It's good," Caleb finally said, nodding toward the food. "Better than I've had in years." May's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. Acknowledgement, maybe relief. "I'll earn my keep, Mr. Ridgway. You'll have no cause to regret the arrangement." The arrangement. As if this were simple employment, as if the child sitting at his table didn't carry his blood and his birthmark and his impossible eyes. "It's Caleb," he said roughly. "No need for formality under your own roof." "It's your roof," May corrected quietly. "You live here now. That makes it yours too." The words hung in the air, heavier than he'd intended, implying permanence he wasn't sure either of them was prepared to claim. But May didn't argue, just nodded once and turned her attention back to her plate. After the meal, May cleaned while Caleb retreated outside, needing distance, needing the familiar darkness and the space to think without those gray-blue eyes watching him. He checked on Slate, fed the horse, moved through evening chores that usually brought peace, but tonight only amplified the chaos in his head. When he finally returned to the house, May had put Jonah to bed in the room that was now theirs. She stood at the window, her profile outlined by lamplight, looking out at nothing in particular. "He's asleep," she said without turning. The travel was hard on him. Caleb moved to the table, poured himself coffee that had gone lukewarm, drank it anyway. "May," he started, then stopped, not knowing how to navigate this conversation, how to ask questions that deserved asking without sounding like an accusation. She turned to face him then, and her expression held that same careful neutrality she'd worn since stepping off the stage. "You want to know why I never told you? I want to know—" He set the cup down harder than necessary. "I want to know everything. How you managed, why you came here, what you expect from me now." "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how to find you," May said, her voice level but carrying an edge of steel beneath. "You left no forwarding address, no indication of where you'd gone. The few people who knew you said you drifted, that you worked ranches across Montana and Wyoming, never staying long. By the time I realized I was carrying your child, you were already gone like smoke." Caleb flinched at the image, at the accuracy of it. He had been smoke, insubstantial, directionless, disappearing before anyone could grab hold. "I managed because I had to," May continued. "I worked until I couldn't hide the pregnancy anymore, then took on washing and mending I could do in a back room. After Jonah was born, I found places that would tolerate a woman with a child, kitchens that needed help, boarding houses that traded work for shelter. We survived." The simplicity of that statement, "we survived," contained universes of hardship that Caleb could only begin to imagine. A woman alone with an illegitimate child, moving through towns that judged, employers who exploited, a world that offered little mercy to those without protection or position. "And now?" he asked. "What do you want from me?" May met his gaze directly, unflinching. "Exactly what the advertisement offered: work and shelter. A place where my son can sleep without me wondering if we'll be asked to leave in the morning. I'm not here for charity or for anything you don't freely give. I can cook, keep house, help with whatever needs doing. If that's worth room and board, then we have an arrangement. If it's not—" She paused, and he saw the fear she was trying to hide. "Then you can put us on the next stage to town and I'll find something else." "And Jonah?" Caleb's voice came out rough. "What about him?" "Jonah is my son. My responsibility. You didn't know about him, and I'm not asking you to claim him now. He's done fine without a father this long. He'll continue to do fine." The words should have been a relief, an escape from obligation, freedom from responsibility he'd never chosen. Instead, they felt like a door closing, like being offered an easy exit from something that might matter. Caleb looked toward the bedroom where the boy slept, thought about those eyes that mirrored his own, that birthmark that made denial impossible. Thought about 5 years of a child's life spent in rooms where he wasn't entirely welcome, depending on a mother's strength because his father had been too lost to even know he existed. "He looks like me," Caleb said finally. "Yes." No elaboration, no softening of that truth. "Anyone who sees him will know." "Then they'll know." May's chin lifted again, that gesture of pride in the face of judgment. "I stopped caring what people assumed a long time ago." Silence settled between them, thick with things unsaid, weighted with choices that would reshape both their lives. The lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Outside, a coyote called to the rising moon, and somewhere in the distance, cattle answered with their own low sounds. "The arrangement stands," Caleb said finally. "You cook, keep house, help where needed, room and board, and wages, $20 a month." He watched her eyes widen slightly at the amount, which was more than fair for frontier work. "As for the boy," he paused, choosing words carefully, "he's here. That's enough for now." May nodded slowly, and something in her shoulders relaxed fractionally, though her guard remained firmly in place. "Thank you, Mr. Ridge. Caleb." "We'll figure the rest out as we go," Caleb said, more to himself than to her. "For now, you should get some sleep. Morning comes early on a ranch." May moved toward the bedroom, then paused at the doorway. "Caleb," she said, and waited until he looked at her. "I won't let him be a burden to you. Whatever else happens, know that." She disappeared into the room before he could respond, leaving him alone with cold coffee and thoughts that refused to settle into any kind of order. Caleb climbed the ladder to the loft, stretched out on the narrow bed he'd moved up there that afternoon while May explored the property with Jonah. Through the floorboards, he could hear quiet sounds. May preparing for sleep, the rustle of blankets, her soft voice as she spoke to the boy, though he couldn't make out the words. Then silence, deep and complete, the kind that used to bring him peace. But tonight, the silence felt different. Tonight, it was populated by awareness of other heartbeats in his home, other lives intersecting with his own. He stared at the ceiling beams he'd examined 1,000 times before and tried to understand how a single afternoon had transformed everything he thought he knew about his carefully constructed solitude. The boy, Jonah, carried his blood, his features, his legacy. A child he'd never intended to create, never knew existed, and now couldn't unknow. A son who'd survived 5 years without him and might not need him even now. And May, who'd endured those years alone, who'd traveled across territory to accept work from a stranger who happened to be the man who'd left her pregnant and unaware, who asked for nothing except the dignity of honest work, who protected her son with quiet fierceness, who looked at Caleb without blame or expectation, but with a wariness that suggested she'd learned not to trust in permanence. Caleb turned on his side, pulled the blanket up against the autumn chill seeping through the walls, and closed his eyes against thoughts that wouldn't quiet. Tomorrow, he'd have to figure out how to navigate this new reality, how to run a ranch with a woman and child in his home, how to act around a son he didn't know, how to be something other than smoke and solitude. But tonight, in the darkness, he could admit the truth he'd spent the evening avoiding. When he'd seen Jonah's face and recognized himself in those small features, the feeling that had gripped his chest wasn't just shock or fear. It was recognition. Not just of shared blood, but of something deeper. A connection he'd spent years running from, a belonging he'd convinced himself he didn't need, reflected back at him in the eyes of a child who didn't yet know his name. And May, standing in his kitchen, transforming his meager supplies into something approaching comfort, moving through his space with quiet competence, had awakened something he'd thought long dead, the possibility that solitude wasn't the same as peace, that isolation wasn't protection but slow starvation of something essential. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, carrying the promise of winter down from the mountains. Inside, the house settled into its night sounds, wood cooling, foundations shifting, the ordinary music of a structure at rest. But nothing about this night was ordinary. Nothing about tomorrow would be what it was before. And as Caleb finally drifted toward uneasy sleep, he couldn't decide whether that terrified him or offered something he'd been missing without knowing to name it. Below, in the room that was now theirs, May lay beside her sleeping son and stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to the house around her, feeling the weight of the man's presence in the loft above. She'd gambled everything on this position, traveled across territory, brought her child into proximity with a father who'd never chosen fatherhood, all for the chance at stability she'd been chasing since Jonah's birth. She'd seen the recognition in Caleb's eyes when he looked at their son, seen the way his carefully maintained composure cracked when confronted with undeniable evidence. And she'd seen something else too. Beneath the shock and the questions, a flicker of something that might have been longing, quickly shuddered but present nonetheless. May didn't believe in fairy tales or rescue. She'd learned through hard experience that survival was her own responsibility, that depending on others led only to disappointment. But she also knew that sometimes, rarely, circumstances aligned in ways that offered more than mere survival. This ranch, this hard man with his careful defenses, this chance at something approaching normalcy for her son, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was an opportunity to build something solid if she was strong enough and careful enough and lucky enough to make it work. Jonah stirred in his sleep, pressing closer to her warmth, and May wrapped her arm around him protectively. Whatever came next, whatever Caleb decided about his role in Jonah's life, she would make sure her son was safe, was fed, was sheltered. She'd done it for 5 years against steeper odds than this. But as she finally let herself relax into the unexpected comfort of a real bed in a room that might be theirs for more than a few weeks, May allowed herself one small hope, that maybe, just maybe, survival could evolve into something more. That this harsh land and this guarded man and this fragile arrangement might somehow become the foundation of the home she'd been searching for all along. Outside, the Montana night deepened, stars emerging in the vast darkness above the ranch, where three people lay separate but connected, each carrying their own fears and hopes into the uncertain future that morning would bring. Dawn broke cold and pale over the Montana mountains, and Caleb woke to sounds he hadn't heard in his home for 8 years. The quiet murmur of a woman's voice, the lighter response of a child, the clatter of cookware being handled with careful precision. He lay still in the loft for a moment, disoriented by the domestic symphony rising through the floorboards, before memory reassembled itself and yesterday's reality settled back into place. May Turner, Jonah, his son. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn chill, descended the ladder to find May already at the stove, coaxing heat from embers he'd banked the night before. She wore the same dark blue dress, her hair again pulled back in that practical bun, and she moved through his kitchen like she was learning its geography, testing the damper, finding the coffee tin, discovering which boards creaked underfoot. Jonah sat at the table, still in what must have been his nightshirt, watching his mother with those unnervingly familiar eyes. When Caleb's boots hit the floor, the boy's gaze swung toward him, curious but cautious. "Morning," Caleb said, the word feeling awkward in his mouth, too casual for the strangeness of the situation. "Good morning." May glanced over her shoulder briefly, then returned her attention to the stove. "Coffee will be ready soon. I found oats. I'll make porridge if that suits." "That's fine." Caleb moved to the basin, splashed water on his face that was cold enough to shock, dragged a towel across his skin. When he turned back, Jonah was still watching him with that steady, evaluating stare that children sometimes possessed, the kind that saw more than adults wanted to reveal. "You talk to horses?" the boy asked suddenly, his voice small but clear. Caleb blinked. "What?" "Mama said you have horses. Do you talk to them?" Jonah's head tilted slightly, genuinely curious. "Mama talks to the chickens sometimes. She says it's polite." Despite everything, Caleb felt something shift in his chest, not quite a smile, but close. "I suppose I do talk to my horse. His name is Slate. He doesn't answer much, but he listens better than most people." "Can I meet him?" The eagerness in Jonah's voice was unmistakable, the first real animation Caleb had seen from the boy since his arrival. May turned from the stove, a spoon still in her hand. "Jonah, Mr. Ridge, Caleb has work to do. You can't be underfoot asking questions." "He can meet the horse," Caleb heard himself say. "After breakfast, if that's all right with you." May's expression suggested surprise, but she nodded. "After breakfast, then, and only if you stay out of the way and do exactly as you're told." Jonah's face lit up with a smile that transformed his serious features into something unbearably young and hopeful, and Caleb had to turn away, pretending interest in the rifle mounted above the door, anything to avoid the fierce protectiveness that surged through him at that small smile. They ate porridge sweetened with a precious spoonful of molasses. May had found in the back of the cupboard, drank coffee that she'd somehow made less punishing than his usual brew, and fell into a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't entirely strained either. It was the silence of people learning to occupy the same space, finding rhythms that might eventually become familiar. After the meal, Caleb led Jonah out to the barn, while May began washing dishes, her figure visible through the window as they crossed the yard. The morning air bit cold, carrying the scent of frost and pine from the mountains. Jonah walked close to Caleb's side, almost but not quite touching, his small boots scuffing the dirt. The barn was dim and warm, smelling of hay and horse and leather. Slate stood in his stall, a big gray gelding with intelligent eyes and a patient temperament that had served Caleb well through years of hard work. The horse lifted his head as they entered, ears pricked forward with interest. "That's Slate," Caleb said, stopping a few feet from the stall. "He's 14 hands high, about 9 years old now. He's steady, doesn't spook easy." Jonah stared up at the horse with wide eyes, and Caleb saw the hesitation there, the way the boy wanted to approach but didn't quite dare. Without thinking, Caleb reached down and lifted Jonah up to his hip, holding him steady so he was level with Slate's head. The child went very still in his arms, and Caleb realized with a jolt that this might be the first time he'd actually held his son. The boy was lighter than expected, all bone and sinew beneath his clothes, and he fit against Caleb's side with an ease that felt both natural and terrifying. "Hold your hand out flat," Caleb instructed quietly. "Let him smell you first. Horses like to know who they're dealing with." Jonah extended his small hand carefully, palm up, and Slate stretched his neck forward to investigate, nostrils flaring as he caught the boy's scent. Then the horse did something Caleb hadn't expected. He lowered his head and gently bumped it against Jonah's chest, a gesture of acceptance that the gelding rarely offered strangers. Jonah's delighted laugh rang through the barn, pure and unguarded, and Caleb felt that sound lodge somewhere deep in his chest where it had no business being. "He likes me!" Jonah exclaimed, looking at Caleb with joy radiating from every feature. "Did you see? He likes me." "He does," Caleb agreed, and had to clear his throat against the unexpected roughness there. "You can pet his nose if you're gentle. Just like that, soft touches." Jonah's small hand stroked Slate's velvety nose with surprising gentleness, and the horse stood perfectly still, accepting the attention with the patience of a creature who understood exactly how precious and fragile this small human was. They stayed like that for several minutes, Jonah petting Slate and asking questions in a steady stream. What did Slate eat? Where did he sleep? Did he have friends? Could horses run as fast as trains? And Caleb answered each one, still holding the boy against his side, still marveling at the strange rightness of this weight in his arms. Finally, Caleb set Jonah down carefully. "I've got work to do now. Cattle to check, fence line to inspect. Your mama will need you back at the house." Jonah's face fell slightly, but he nodded with the resigned acceptance of a child used to adult priorities taking precedence. "Can I come back to see Slate?" "Every day if you want." The promise emerged before Caleb fully considered it, but watching Jonah's face brighten again, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. They walked back to the house together, and May met them at the door, her gaze moving between Caleb and Jonah with an expression he couldn't quite read. Wariness, perhaps, or maybe something closer to hope, carefully restrained. "He was good?" she asked. "Better than good. Slate took to him right away." Caleb hesitated, then added, "He can visit the horse whenever he wants, long as it doesn't interfere with anything you need from him." May's eyes met his, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe gratitude, definitely surprise. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Jonah, go inside and get dressed properly. It's too cold to be running around in your nightshirt." The boy disappeared into the house, and May and Caleb stood in the doorway, the morning sun climbing higher, burning off the frost that had silvered the grass. "You didn't have to do that," May said after a moment. "Make promises to him." "Wasn't a promise, just a fact." Caleb pulled his hat lower, uncomfortable with gratitude, with the intimacy of this conversation. "Boy should know the animals if he's living here." "Living here," May repeated, testing the words. "For how long?" It was a fair question, one that demanded an answer Caleb wasn't sure he could give. "For as long as the arrangement works," he said finally. "I'm not in the habit of turning people out without cause." May nodded slowly, but her expression remained guarded, and Caleb understood that she'd heard promises before, had learned to measure words against actions and find them wanting. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Caleb with its steadiness. May transformed the house in small ways. Curtains appeared in the windows. Dishes were organized with logic he hadn't considered. Meals arrived at regular times with variety he'd forgotten food could possess. She moved through her work with quiet efficiency, never asking for help but accepting it when offered, maintaining a careful distance that felt both respectful and protective. Jonah proved true to his mother's promise about not being trouble. He occupied himself with small tasks May invented for him, gathering eggs, stacking kindling, learning to pump water from the well. When these were done, he'd drift to the barn where Caleb inevitably found himself working, and the boy would settle onto a hay bale, content to watch in silence or ask his endless questions about ranch life, about horses, about the mountains visible in the distance. Caleb discovered he didn't mind the company. Jonah had learned to read silence, to understand when answers were welcome and when quiet was preferred. The boy possessed a watchfulness that reminded Caleb of himself at that age, an ability to observe and absorb without demanding attention, to find satisfaction in understanding how things worked. On the fourth morning, Caleb was repairing fence in the near pasture when Jonah appeared at his elbow, studying the way he twisted wire around the post. "You're making it tight," Jonah observed, "so the cows can't push through." "That's right." Caleb demonstrated the technique, his hands moving with practiced ease. "Cattle are stronger than they look. Fence has to be stronger still." "Can I try?" Caleb paused, wire cutters in hand, looking down at the boy's upturned face. The request was simple, the kind any child might make, but it felt weighted with significance he couldn't quite name. Teaching implied continuity, suggested a future where such skills would matter. "All right," he said, and handed Jonah a length of wire. "But careful, it's sharp. You wrap it like this, see? 3 times around, then twist the ends together." Jonah's small fingers struggled with the wire's stiffness, but he persisted with a determination that Caleb recognized from his own stubborn nature. When the boy finally managed a passable twist, pride blazed across his features. "I did it! Look, I did it!" "You did," Caleb confirmed, and felt something warm expand in his chest at the boy's accomplishment. "A few more like that, and you'll be fixing fence on your own." They worked together for another hour, Caleb taking the difficult sections while Jonah handled what he could manage, and when they finally headed back toward the house for the midday meal, the boy's chatter had taken on a comfortable quality, like he was talking to someone he trusted rather than a stranger who happened to share his blood. May watched them approach from the kitchen window, and when Caleb met her gaze, he saw something complicated cross her face. Relief, maybe, or concern, or both tangled together in ways she was still trying to navigate. That evening, after Jonah had been put to bed and May had finished her kitchen work, she joined Caleb on the porch, where he sat smoking, watching the stars emerge against the darkening sky. She lowered herself onto the step below him, maintaining that careful distance, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. "He's getting attached to you," she said quietly, not looking at him. "To this place." Caleb drew on his cigarette, considering his words. "Is that a problem?" "It could be." May's voice carried a thread of something sharp beneath the calm. "If this doesn't last. If you decide one day that a woman and child are more trouble than they're worth." "I don't make decisions like that lightly." "You made one once." The words weren't accusatory, just factual, a reminder of history they both carried. "You left Billings without looking back." Caleb was silent for a long moment, smoke curling from his lips into the night air. "I was different then. Running from things I couldn't name, trying to outpace grief that followed me anyway." "What were you grieving?" It was the first personal question she'd asked, and it deserved honesty. "My parents died the year before. Influenza. Then my brother in a riding accident 6 months later. The ranch we'd built together went to pay debts I didn't know existed. I was 23 and had nothing left except the knowledge that everyone I cared about disappeared one way or another." May turned to look at him then, her face pale in the starlight. "So you made sure to disappear first?" "Something like that." Caleb stubbed out the cigarette against the porch railing. "Spent 5 years drifting, working ranches, staying just long enough to earn wages before moving on. Told myself I preferred it that way. No attachments, no losses. What changed? Found this place. Previous owner was dying, no heirs, wanted someone who'd actually work the land instead of letting it go to speculators. Sold it to me for less than it was worth, on the condition I'd stay, make something of it." Caleb gestured toward the dark shapes of the barn, the pasture beyond. "Figured maybe I'd run far enough. Maybe it was time to stop." "And now?" May's voice was barely above a whisper. "Now that we're here?" Caleb looked at her. This woman who'd survived 5 years of hardship he could only imagine, who'd raised his son alone, who'd traveled across territory to accept work from a stranger without knowing that stranger was the father of her child. She held herself with such careful dignity, such fierce protection of what little she had, and he understood that she was asking for something more than reassurance about employment. She was asking if he was still running, still the man who disappeared before dawn, asking if Jonah's growing attachment would end in abandonment, if the safety she'd found here was real or just another temporary shelter before the next displacement. "I'm not leaving," Caleb said, and meant it with a certainty that surprised him. "This is my land, my home. You and the boy—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "You're here because I said you could be. That doesn't change on a whim. People change their minds. May's voice carried the weight of experience. Circumstances shift. A child underfoot, a woman's presence changing the household you built for solitude. It's not what you planned for. No, Caleb agreed. It's not what I planned. But plans aren't sacred. Life happens whether you're ready or not. May studied him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing his words, testing them against promises she'd heard before. Finally, she nodded, though the wariness didn't entirely leave her eyes. Jonah talks about you constantly, she said, and something like resignation colored her tone. Caleb showed me this. Caleb taught me that. Caleb says horses listen better than people. He's never had... She stopped, throat working. He's never had a man pay attention to him like that. Never had someone teach him things, include him in work. He's starving for it, and I can't... Her voice cracked slightly. I can't protect him from the hurt if you change your mind. The raw vulnerability in those words hit Caleb harder than any accusation could have. He saw it clearly now. May's fear wasn't for herself, but for Jonah, for the boy who was forming bonds that would devastate him if broken. She was asking Caleb to consider the weight of his casual kindnesses, the significance of teaching a child to fix fence, of daily visits to the barn, of becoming someone Jonah looked to with trust and hope. I won't hurt him, Caleb said, and heard the promise in his own voice, the commitment he was making without fully understanding its scope. I won't be perfect. Hell, I don't know the first thing about being a father, but I won't disappear, and I won't make him feel like he's unwanted. May's shoulders sagged slightly, some tension releasing, though she didn't entirely relax. He's a good boy, smart, kind, eager to please. He deserves better than... She gestured vaguely, encompassing their circumstances, the complications of his existence. He deserves better than me, Caleb finished quietly. But he's got me anyway. Might as well try to do right by him. They sat in silence after that, the night deepening around them, the temperature dropping toward frost. Inside, the lamp they'd left burning cast warm light through the windows, and Caleb thought about the boy sleeping in the bedroom, about how that small presence had already changed the feel of his home, made it less of a fortress and more of a dwelling place where life actually happened. May, he said after a while, and waited until she looked at him. About that night in Billings, you don't need to explain, she interrupted quickly. It was what it was. I'm not asking for apologies or explanations. Maybe not, but you deserve both. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. I was drunk and grieving and using anything I could find to forget for a while. That doesn't excuse leaving the way I did, doesn't excuse not being more careful, not thinking about consequences. You carried those consequences alone for 5 years. That's on me. May was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, I could have been more careful too. I knew what I was doing, knew the risks. I wanted... She paused, and when she continued, her voice was barely audible. I wanted to feel something other than lonely for one night. Wanted to believe someone saw me, even if it couldn't last. That was my choice as much as yours. The honesty in that admission created a space between them where blame couldn't easily exist, where they were just two people who'd made choices in pain and isolation, choices that had created a child neither had planned for, but who existed nonetheless, shaping both their futures, whether they were ready or not. He's got my birthmark, Caleb said, shifting the conversation. Same place, same shape. My father had it, my grandfather. Goes back generations, according to family stories. I know. I noticed it the day he was born. May pulled her shawl tighter, a gesture that seemed more about comfort than cold. I knew immediately whose child I'd carried. Knew you'd recognize it too, if you ever saw him. That's why I hesitated when I realized whose ranch I'd be coming to. Thought about backing out, finding other work. Why didn't you? Because other work is hard to find for a woman with a child. Because winter's coming and I needed something stable before snow closed the passes. Because... She stopped, and Caleb saw her jaw tighten. Because maybe I wanted you to know. Wanted him to know where he came from, even if it didn't mean anything beyond that. It means something, Caleb said quietly. I don't know what yet exactly, but it means something. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks, a reminder that autumn was yielding to harsher seasons. Soon the ranch would be locked in by winter, isolated from town, dependent entirely on their own resources and the preparations they'd made. The thought of spending those long months with May and Jonah, of the forced intimacy of shared space when wind howled and snow piled high, should have felt like a trap. Instead, it felt like possibility. Days passed, and Caleb found himself watching Jonah with increasing attention, noticing things he'd missed in the first confused rush of discovery. The way the boy favored his left hand for fine work, but threw with his right. The small scar on his knee that May said came from a fall on icy steps 2 winters ago. The careful way he ate, never wasting food, suggesting meals hadn't always been certain. The quick intelligence in his questions. The way he absorbed information and applied it without being told twice. Caleb began teaching him deliberately how to curry a horse properly, how to read weather signs in the clouds, how to move around cattle without spooking them. Jonah learned with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was valuable, that skills meant security. He never complained when tasks were difficult, never asked for easier work, and the pride he took in accomplishment was something fierce and beautiful to witness. May watched these lessons from a distance, her expression unreadable, but Caleb noticed she'd stopped hovering quite so protectively. She was allowing the connection to form, giving Jonah space to bond with this man who was biologically his father, but functionally still a stranger. It must have cost her, that trust, and Caleb didn't take it lightly. 2 weeks into their arrangement, a cold rain swept down from the mountains, turning the yard to mud and driving them all indoors. May cooked stew while rain drummed on the roof, and Jonah occupied himself at the table with bits of wood and string, constructing something only he understood. Caleb sat cleaning his rifle, the familiar ritual soothing in its precision, when Jonah's voice broke the comfortable silence. "Caleb? Yeah? Are you my father?" The question landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples that spread through the room. May's hand stilled at the stove, her back going rigid. Caleb's own hand stopped moving, cloth frozen against gunmetal. He looked at Jonah, who watched him with those 2 familiar eyes, his small face serious and expectant, waiting for an answer to a question that would shape how he understood himself, his place in the world, his worth. "Yes," Caleb said simply, because the boy deserved truth without evasion. "I am." Jonah absorbed this with a slow nod, then asked, "Why don't you live with us?" "I do live with you. We're all here, under the same roof." "But before, why didn't you live with us before?" Caleb set the rifle aside carefully, giving the boy his full attention. "Because I didn't know about you. Your mama and I, we knew each other for a very short time, years ago. I left before either of us knew you were coming. If I'd known, things would have been different." "How different?" Jonah's voice was small now, uncertainty creeping in. "I would have found a way to help, would have made sure you and your mama had what you needed." Caleb paused, then added, "I'm sorry I wasn't there. That's my failing, not yours." "Mama said you didn't know. She said it wasn't your fault or mine." Jonah's fingers twisted the string he'd been playing with. "She said sometimes people come into our lives when they're supposed to, not always when we want them to." Caleb's gaze shifted to May, who still stood with her back to them, shoulders tight with tension. "Your mama's a wise woman," he said quietly. "She's right. I came into your life late, but I'm here now. That gonna be all right with you?" Jonah considered this with the gravity of someone much older, then smiled, tentative but genuine. "I like it here. I like Slate and the chickens and learning about fence. I like you." The simple declaration hit Caleb somewhere he hadn't known he was vulnerable, creating an ache that was half warmth, half terror. "I like you too, Jonah," he said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. May turned from the stove finally, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and she nodded at Caleb, gratitude, acknowledgement, something deeper he didn't have words for. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and said briskly, "Stew's ready. Wash up, both of you." They ate together while rain continued its assault on the roof, and the conversation drifted to safer topics. Whether the cattle had found shelter, what repairs the barn would need before heavy snow, how many jars of preserves they'd need to put up before winter truly set in. But something had shifted in the room, Some invisible barrier had been acknowledged and carefully dismantled, and the space they shared felt different now, less like a temporary arrangement, more like the foundation of something that might endure. That night, after Jonah had fallen asleep and May had retreated to her room, Caleb lay in the loft listening to the rain and thinking about the question the boy had asked. "Are you my father?" The answer was yes, biologically indisputable, marked in the child's features in that telltale birthmark. But being a father required more than blood. It required presence, consistency, the willingness to be someone a child could depend on when the world felt uncertain. Caleb had never wanted that responsibility, had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. But lying in the darkness with rain washing the world outside and his son sleeping below, he realized that want had nothing to do with it anymore. Jonah existed. Jonah needed. And Caleb had the choice to either step forward into that need or remain at the safe distance of biological fact without emotional investment. The choice, when he examined it honestly, had already been made. It had been made the moment he'd lifted Jonah up to meet Slate, the moment he'd shown the boy how to twist wire, the moment he'd promised daily visits to the barn. It had been made without him fully realizing it, his careful defenses eroding under the patient assault of a child's trust and hope. He was Jonah's father, not just in blood, but in the ways that would shape the boy's life. Teach him how men moved through the world, show him what strength looked like when tempered with gentleness. The weight of that responsibility should have felt crushing. Instead, it felt like purpose, like the missing piece he hadn't known he'd been searching for through all those years of drift and deliberate isolation. It terrified him. But terror, Caleb was discovering, could coexist with certainty, with the knowledge that some fears were worth facing because the alternative, remaining safe but alone, was a slower form of dying. Rain drummed on, washing the autumn dust from the world, preparing the land for the winter that would lock them all together in this small space. And Caleb closed his eyes, accepting what he could no longer deny. His life of solitude was over, transformed by a woman's quiet strength and a boy's simple trust into something infinitely more complicated and impossibly more real. The rain continued through the night and into the next day, transforming the ranch into an island of mud and mist. Caleb worked through it anyway, checking cattle that huddled miserable in the lee of rocky outcroppings, reinforcing sections of fence that sagged under the weight of water and wind. He returned to the house soaked through, boots caked with mud, to find May heating water on the stove and Jonah pressed against the window watching for his return. "You're drowned," May said, taking in his condition with a critical eye. "There's hot water for washing. I'll get you dry clothes." "I can manage," Caleb protested, but she was already moving toward the bedroom, returning with one of his own shirts she must have washed and mended without him noticing. The sleeve that had been torn for months was neatly repaired, the fabric softer than he remembered. He washed at the basin while May turned her attention back to whatever she was cooking, and Jonah resumed his window vigil, though Caleb caught the boy sneaking glances at him, as if verifying he was real and present and hadn't been swept away by the storm. "Anything happen while I was out?" Caleb asked, pulling on the dry shirt. "Chickens are unhappy about the rain," Jonah reported seriously. "They made complaining noises. Mama said they're spoiled." "They are spoiled," May confirmed, "and they'll survive a little weather, unlike some people who insist on working in it when they could wait a day." Caleb heard the concern beneath her practical tone. "Cattle don't wait for good weather. They need checking regardless. And if you catch your death doing it, what then?" May set a cup of hot coffee in front of him with more force than necessary. "You think that helps anyone?" It was the first time she'd shown anything resembling anger toward him, and Caleb found himself oddly pleased by it, pleased that she cared enough to be worried, pleased that the careful distance she maintained had cracks where real feeling could leak through. "I'll be fine," he said, gentler. "Done this for years. Know my limits." May's mouth tightened, but she didn't push further. Instead, she ladled soup into bowls, and they ate while rain continued its assault, and the house creaked around them, a small vessel of warmth in a cold, wet world. That evening, with weather making outdoor work impossible, Caleb found himself at loose ends. Usually he'd read or work on tack that needed mending, but Jonah had spread his collection of wood scraps and string on the table, and the boy's concentrated efforts drew Caleb's attention. "What are you building?" he asked. Jonah looked up, surprise and pleasure mingling on his face. A barn, for Slate, so he doesn't get wet. He held up a lopsided construction that bore only the most generous resemblance to a barn. That's good thinking. Horse deserves proper shelter. Caleb studied the structure. You know, if you notch the pieces here and here, they'll fit together stronger. Won't fall apart so easy. Will you show me? Jonah's eagerness was immediate, unguarded. Caleb fetched his knife, and for the next hour, he and Jonah worked together, cutting notches, fitting pieces, creating something that actually looked like a miniature barn. May watched from her chair near the stove where she was mending, her needle moving with steady rhythm, her expression soft in the lamplight. My father taught me to whittle when I was about your age, Caleb said, guiding Jonah's hands on the knife handle, keeping the blade at a safe angle. We'd sit on the porch summer evenings, cutting wood into shapes. I made horses mostly, terrible horses, all out of proportion, but he never said so, just showed me how to do it better next time. Where's your father now? Jonah asked, and the question held simple curiosity without understanding of the pain underneath. He died. Him and my mother both, when I was younger. Sickness took them. Caleb kept his voice even, factual. My brother too, not long after. Accident with a horse. Jonah's small face turned solemn, processing this information. That's sad. Were you lonely? The directness of children, their ability to cut straight to the heart of things, never ceased to catch Caleb off guard. Yeah, he admitted. I was lonely for a long time, still am sometimes. You don't have to be lonely now, Jonah said, with the absolute certainty of a child who hadn't yet learned that proximity didn't always cure isolation. You have us, me and Mama, we're here. Caleb's throat tightened, and he had to focus very hard on the wood in his hands, on the careful angle of the blade. You're right, he managed. You are here. May's needle had stilled, and when Caleb glanced her direction, he found her watching him with an expression that made something in his chest ache. Tenderness, understanding, a shared recognition of how thoroughly this child was reshaping both their carefully guarded hearts. The rain finally broke 3 days later, leaving the world washed clean and the sky a blue so sharp it hurt to look at. Caleb returned to full work with a vengeance, and May began the serious business of preparing the household for winter. She took inventory of supplies, made lists of what they'd need from town, inspected the root cellar, and declared it wanting. We'll need more potatoes, dried beans, flour, she told Caleb over breakfast. Sugar if you can spare the expense. Salt pork. The chickens will need extra feed if we're snowed in for weeks at a stretch. Make a complete list, Caleb said. I'll take the wagon to town end of the week. You and Jonah should come. You'll know better than me what's needed, and the boys should see civilization before we're locked in till spring. May hesitated, and Caleb saw the calculation in her eyes. The risk of being seen in town with him, of people drawing conclusions, of judgment that might fall harder on Jonah than on either adult. Small towns had long memories and sharp tongues, and a woman with an illegitimate child traveling with the child's father made for exactly the kind of gossip that could follow a family for years. People will talk regardless, Caleb said quietly, reading her thoughts. Might as well give them something honest to talk about. The boy's mine. I'm not ashamed of that, and you shouldn't have to hide him. I've never hidden him, May said, but her voice carried the weariness of someone who'd defended her son's existence more times than she could count. But I've learned there's a difference between not hiding and deliberately inviting scrutiny. Let them scrutinize. Won't change facts. Caleb drained his coffee, set the cup down with finality. We need supplies. You need to pick them out proper. So we go to town, all three of us. Anyone has something to say about it can say it to my face. The fierce protectiveness in his tone seemed to surprise May, but after a moment she nodded. All right, we'll go together. The trip to town took most of the day. 2 hours by wagon over roads still muddy from rain. Jonah wedged between Caleb and May on the bench seat, asking questions about every landmark, every bird, every distant mountain. The boy's wonder in the wider world beyond the ranch was something pure and infectious, and Caleb found himself pointing out things he'd stopped noticing years ago. The way aspens turned gold in autumn, how elk moved in herds across high meadows, the difference between hawk and eagle in flight. May sat quiet for most of the journey, one hand resting on Jonah's shoulder, her gaze moving across landscape she must have traveled before, but perhaps never with this sense of security, never sitting beside the father of her child while he openly claimed that connection. The town of Ridgemont wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a few other establishments serving ranchers and miners scattered across the territory. Caleb drove the wagon straight to Morton's general store, helped May down while Jonah scrambled after them, eyes wide at the bustle of people and horses and goods on display. Inside, the store smelled of coffee and leather and the sharp tang of pickle brine. Mrs. Morton stood behind the counter, a formidable woman who'd run the establishment since her husband died a decade prior. She looked up as they entered, and Caleb saw her gaze move from him to May to Jonah, saw the exact moment recognition and calculation occurred. "Caleb Ridgway," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "Haven't seen you in months. Heard you'd found yourself some help out at the ranch." "Mrs. Morton," Caleb nodded respectfully. "This is May Turner, my cook and housekeeper, and this is Jonah." He put his hand on the boy's shoulder, the gesture deliberate, claiming, "We're here to stock up for winter." Mrs. Morton's eyebrows rose fractionally as she took in Jonah's features, the unmistakable resemblance to the man whose hand rested on his shoulder. "I see," she said, and those two words carried volumes. Then, surprising Caleb, her expression softened slightly as she looked at the boy. "Well, Jonah, have you ever had a peppermint stick?" Jonah glanced at May, who nodded permission, and the boy shook his head solemnly. "Well, that's a shame needs correcting." Mrs. Morton produced a jar from beneath the counter, offered it to Jonah. "Pick whichever color you like. Consider it a welcome to Ridgemont." The kindness in the gesture, unexpected and genuine, seemed to break something in the atmosphere. May's shoulders relaxed incrementally, and Jonah selected a peppermint stick with careful deliberation, whispering his thanks. They spent the next hour gathering supplies while Mrs. Morton efficiently tallied and wrapped. Other customers came and went, and Caleb saw the looks, heard the whispers that started the moment people recognized him with a woman and child. He met every gaze directly, daring anyone to make their thoughts verbal, and most had the sense to keep their speculation quiet. Only one man, a rancher named Hewitt, who'd never liked Caleb much anyway, made the mistake of speaking loud enough to be overheard. "Didn't know Ridgway was the marrying type, though I suppose some don't bother with formalities." Caleb turned slowly, and May's hand on his arm was the only thing that kept him from crossing the store. "Let it go," she murmured. "He's not worth it." "He's insulting you," Caleb said, voice low and dangerous. "He's insulting himself by caring about other people's business." May's grip tightened. "Please, for Jonah." The boy stood close to May, peppermint stick forgotten in his hand, watching the adults with worried eyes. Caleb forced himself to breathe, to unclench his fists, to remember that brawling in Morton's store wouldn't help anyone and would only confirm whatever ugly stories Hewitt wanted to spread. "You're right," he said finally, and turned his back on Hewitt's smirk, which was perhaps the greater insult anyway. They finished loading supplies while clouds gathered again in the west, threatening more rain. Caleb helped May onto the wagon bench, lifted Jonah up after her, and was about to climb up himself when a voice called his name. He turned to find Sheriff Thomas approaching, a man Caleb knew slightly from previous trips to town. Thomas was fair-minded as lawmen went, more interested in keeping peace than enforcing every petty regulation. "Caleb," Thomas said, nodding greeting. Then, to May, "Ma'am." His gaze dropped to Jonah with the same recognition everyone seemed to have. "Wanted to check in, make sure everything's settled out at your place before winter locks in." "Settled enough," Caleb said, wary of where this might lead. "Good, good." Thomas shifted his weight, clearly working toward something. "Look, people are going to talk. That's the nature of small towns. But I wanted you to know, far as I'm concerned, what happens on your ranch is your business. You're not bothering anyone. You pay your bills. You don't cause trouble." He glanced at May. "A woman and her boy need a place to live and honest work. That's nobody's concern but those involved." "Appreciate that, Sheriff," May said quietly. "That said," Thomas continued, looking back at Caleb, "might be easier on everyone if certain formalities were observed. Just something to consider, especially with the boy to think about. Children have a way of suffering for adults' choices, deserved or not." He tipped his hat and walked away before Caleb could respond, leaving the implication hanging in the autumn air. May had gone very still beside him, and when Caleb looked at her, he saw her jaw was tight, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "May," he started. "We should go," she said. "Those clouds look like more rain." They drove out of town in silence, Jonah dozing between them, lulled by the wagon's motion and the sugar rush from his peppermint stick. Caleb wanted to say something about the sheriff's words, about the assumptions and expectations of small-town propriety, but May's closed expression warned him off. So he focused on the road, on navigating the ruts and mud, on getting them home before the weather turned. The rain held off until they'd unloaded supplies and put the horses away, then opened up with renewed vengeance. They ate a quiet supper, May moving through the kitchen with mechanical efficiency, Jonah picking up on the tension and staying subdued. After the boy was put to bed, Caleb found May standing at the window, staring out at the rain-dark night. "What the sheriff said," Caleb began, but May cut him off. "He meant marriage. That's the formality he was suggesting." Her voice was flat, carefully controlled. "Make an honest woman of me, legitimize Jonah, give the town nothing to whisper about." "Would that be so terrible?" May turned to face him, and her expression was harder than he'd ever seen it. "You think a piece of paper changes what people believe? You think it erases 5 years of Jonah being born without a father's name? You think it makes us respectable in their eyes, or just confirms we're exactly what they suspected, two people who made a mistake and are trying to cover it up?" "I think it gives Jonah my name," Caleb said steadily. "I think it means nobody questions his place here, his right to inherit what I've built. I think it means you're protected if something happens to me." "Protected," May repeated and laughed without humor. "You think I need protecting? I've survived just fine without a husband, without anyone's name but my own." "I know you have. You're the strongest person I've ever met." Caleb took a step closer, needing her to hear this, to understand. "This isn't about you needing rescue. This is about me wanting—" He stopped, the words harder than expected. "This is about me wanting you both to stay, permanently. Not as employees or temporary arrangements, but as family." May's eyes widened, something flickering across her face too quick to read. "You don't know what you're saying. You barely know us. A few weeks doesn't—" "I know enough," Caleb interrupted. "I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you've raised a boy who's kind and smart and brave despite circumstances that should have broken both of you. I know when I come back to the house now, it feels different, feels like coming home instead of just returning to a place I sleep. I know—" He paused, forcing honesty. "I know I'm not good with words or feelings, and I can't promise I won't mess this up, but I want to try. I want to give Jonah legitimacy and you security, and both of you everything I've got to offer." "Which is what, exactly?" May's voice shook slightly. "A ranch that barely turns profit? A man who admits he doesn't know how to be a husband or father? A life of isolation and hard work in Montana winters that'll freeze you to the bone?" "Yes," Caleb said simply. "That's what I'm offering. It's not much, but it's real. It's yours if you want it." May stared at him, and he saw the war in her eyes, hope against hard-won cynicism, the desire to believe against the lessons of experience. "And if I say no? If I want to keep this as it is, just work, just shelter, nothing more complicated?" "Then that's what we do," Caleb said, though the words cost him. "I meant what I said before. You and Jonah have a place here as long as you want it, regardless of anything else." "You'd let us stay? Even knowing about Jonah, even with the town talking, even if we're not—" She couldn't quite finish. "Even then. I'm not my father's son, May. I don't turn people out for failing to meet expectations." Caleb held her gaze. "But I'm asking. Not because the sheriff suggested it, not because of town gossip. I'm asking because somewhere between you arriving and now, I stopped thinking of you as a cook and started thinking of you as someone I want to build a life with. And Jonah," his throat tightened, "that boy deserves to know he belongs somewhere, that he's wanted, that his father claims him proudly. Marriage makes that official in ways nothing else can." May turned back to the window, and Caleb saw her shoulders tremble slightly. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I swore I'd never depend on a man again. Never put myself or Jonah in a position where someone else's whims determined our future. This isn't whim, and it's not about dependence. Caleb moved to stand beside her, careful not to touch, giving her space. It's about partnership, about building something together that's stronger than either of us alone. You've been doing this by yourself for 5 years, May. You don't have to anymore. She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her face, and Caleb felt helpless in the face of her pain, unsure whether he'd said too much or not enough. I'm terrified, May whispered finally. Terrified of believing this could work. Terrified of what happens to Jonah if it doesn't. He's already attached to you, already thinks of you as his father. If we make this official and then it falls apart, it won't fall apart. Caleb said it with absolute conviction, surprised by his own certainty. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not running. Whatever happens, we face it together. May turned to look at him, searching his face for something. Truth, maybe, or at least honest intention. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because after a long moment, she nodded. Ask me properly, she said. Not because of propriety or town gossip or legitimacy. Ask me because you mean it. Caleb took a breath, feeling the weight of this moment, understanding that what he said next would define everything that followed. May Turner, will you marry me? Will you let me be a proper husband to you and father to Jonah? Will you help me turn this ranch into a real home, build a life that matters, give that boy the family he deserves? Yes, May said, and her voice was steady despite the tears. Yes, I'll marry you. The simplicity of her acceptance made Caleb's chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years. Something that might have been joy, might have been relief, might have been the terrifying vulnerability of having something precious to lose. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, her fingers small and work-roughened in his. We'll go to town next week, Caleb said. Talk to the preacher, make it legal. Nothing fancy, just us, May agreed. Jonah should be there, though. He should see it, understand what it means. Of course, it's his family, too. The words felt right, felt true in ways Caleb was still learning to navigate. They stood together at the window while rain washed the world outside, and Caleb thought about how strange life was, how a man could spend years running from connection only to find himself standing in his own house making promises to a woman he barely knew but somehow understood completely, committing to raise a son who'd existed for 5 years without him, but who'd claimed a place in his heart in mere weeks. It should have felt reckless. Instead, it felt inevitable, like every choice he'd made had been leading here, to this moment, to this woman, and this child, and this chance at redemption he hadn't known he needed. I can't promise perfect, Caleb said quietly. I'll make mistakes. I'll be difficult sometimes. I'm not used to sharing space or making decisions with someone else in mind. I can't promise perfect either, May replied. I'm stubborn and independent, and I've spent too long doing things my way to change easily. I'll probably argue with you more than a proper wife should. Good, Caleb said, and almost smiled. Life's more interesting with a little argument. May did smile then, small but genuine, and Caleb felt absurdly proud of putting that expression on her face. They stayed at the window until the lamp burned low, talking quietly about practical things. When to go to town, what simple ceremony would suit them both, how to explain this to Jonah in ways he'd understand. The conversation was easy, comfortable, and Caleb marveled at how natural it felt to plan a future with this woman, to imagine years stretching ahead where they'd face Montana winters and difficult seasons and the ordinary struggles of ranch life together. When May finally retired to her room, their room soon enough, though neither mentioned that complication yet, Caleb climbed to the loft and lay awake listening to the rain. Tomorrow, he'd have to think about logistics, about making space for a wife, about what marriage would mean in practical daily terms. Tomorrow he'd have to start being the kind of man who deserved the trust May was placing in him, who could be the father Jonah needed, who could build the family they were all reaching toward with tentative hope. But tonight, in the darkness with rain on the roof and the knowledge that May had said yes settling into his bones, Caleb let himself feel something close to peace. It was fragile, this new arrangement, and it would take work to maintain, to grow into something lasting. But for the first time since losing his own family all those years ago, Caleb could imagine a future that held more than solitude and survival. He could imagine belonging, could imagine being part of something larger than himself, something worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth the terrifying vulnerability of letting people matter. And though it scared him more than he'd ever admit out loud, Caleb found he was ready for it, ready to stop running, ready to build instead of drift, ready to become the man this woman and this boy believed he could be, even if he wasn't entirely sure yet how to be that man. He'd figure it out as he went, the way he'd figured out everything else in his life, through trial and error, through showing up every day, through the stubborn persistence that had kept him alive through grief and loss and all the years of lonely wandering. The rain continued its steady rhythm, and Caleb finally let sleep claim him. His last thought, a simple acknowledgement of how completely his life had changed in less than a month, and how impossibly right that change felt despite all the fear and uncertainty it carried. Morning arrived with unexpected clarity. The storm scrubbed skies so blue it seemed impossible after days of gray. Caleb woke to the sounds that were becoming familiar. May moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft murmur of her voice as she spoke to Jonah, the ordinary domestic symphony that had transformed his solitary existence. But this morning carried different weight. The knowledge of promises made shifting how he moved through the world. He descended from the loft to find May already dressed, her hair neatly pinned, and something in her posture suggested she'd been awake for hours, thinking through what they'd agreed to in the rain-dark intimacy of the previous night. Jonah sat at the table eating porridge, and when he saw Caleb, his face brightened with uncomplicated joy. "Caleb, Mama said we might go see Slade after breakfast. Can we? Can we teach him a new trick?" The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Caleb felt some of the morning's awkwardness ease. "Horses don't learn tricks easy as dogs, but we can try. You finish eating first." May set coffee in front of Caleb, and their eyes met briefly. Hers questioning, his steady, confirming without words that last night's conversation hadn't been rain-fueled imagination, but real commitment they'd both have to honor in daylight. "We should tell him," May said quietly, nodding toward Jonah, "before we go to town. He deserves to know what's happening." Caleb nodded, his throat suddenly tight. They'd discussed this last night, but actually doing it felt monumental, like stepping off a cliff and trusting the ground would meet his feet. After breakfast, with dishes cleared and the house settled into its morning quiet, May called Jonah to sit between them at the table. The boy looked from his mother to Caleb, curiosity mixing with the first edges of concern at their serious expressions. "Jonah," May began, her voice gentle but clear, "Caleb and I need to tell you something important, something that's going to change how we live. Are we leaving?" The fear in Jonah's voice was immediate, and Caleb saw how thoroughly the boy's short life had taught him that good things ended, that stability was temporary. "No," Caleb said firmly. "You're not leaving. This is your home now, permanently. That's part of what we want to tell you." May reached for Jonah's hand. "Caleb has asked me to marry him. Do you understand what that means?" Jonah's eyes went wide, darting between them. Like being a real family, like other people have?" "Exactly like that," May confirmed. "Caleb would be your father, not just by blood, but legally. We'd all have the same name. We'd be the Ridgway family." "And we'd stay here? Forever?" The hope in Jonah's voice was almost painful to hear. "Forever," Caleb agreed. "This ranch is yours as much as it's mine. When you're grown, it'll be yours to work, yours to inherit. You'll never have to wonder where you belong or if you're welcome. This is home." For a moment, Jonah just stared at them, processing information that must have seemed too good to be true. Then his small face crumpled, and tears began streaming down his cheeks. Not sad tears, but the overwhelming release of someone who'd carried fear too heavy for such small shoulders, finally being told he could set that burden down. May pulled him into her arms, and Caleb found his own hand reaching out to rest on the boy's back, offering what comfort he could. They stayed like that until Jonah's tears subsided into hiccuping breaths. And when the boy finally pulled back, he wiped his face with his sleeve and looked at Caleb with an expression of such pure trust it made Caleb's chest ache. "Can I call you Papa?" Jonah asked. "Or would you rather I keep saying Caleb?" The question hit Caleb somewhere he hadn't known he was vulnerable. He'd been Caleb to everyone for so long, had never imagined being anyone's father, anyone's papa. But hearing that word in Jonah's tentative voice, seeing the hope behind it, Caleb knew there was only one answer. "Papa would be good," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "I'd like that." Jonah launched himself at Caleb then, small arms wrapping around his neck with fierce strength, and Caleb held the boy close, feeling the rapid beat of his heart, the complete trust in that embrace. Over Jonah's head, he met May's eyes and saw them bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "When?" Jonah asked, pulling back but staying close. "When do we become a real family?" "Next week," May said. "We'll go to town, talk to Reverend Williams, have a small ceremony. Nothing fancy, just the three of us making it official." "Can Slate come?" Jonah asked with the logical earnestness of a 5-year-old. Caleb almost smiled. "Slate has to stay home and watch the ranch, but we'll tell him all about it when we get back." They spent the rest of the morning in the barn, Caleb showing Jonah how to properly groom a horse, while May worked in the house preparing supplies for the coming week's trip to town. The boy chattered constantly, his earlier tears replaced by excitement barely contained, asking questions about the wedding, about what would change, about whether he'd have to call May something different now that they'd all be officially family. "Your mama's still your mama," Caleb explained, running the curry comb down Slate's flank while Jonah watched with intense focus. "That doesn't change. What changes is you'll have both of us, officially and permanently. No one can question it. No one can say you don't belong." "Mrs. Hewitt at the boarding house said I was a—" Jonah stopped, the word clearly one he'd been taught not to repeat. Caleb's hand stilled on Slate's back. "What did she say?" "A bad word. About children without fathers." Jonah's voice had gone small again. "Mama got very quiet and said we were leaving. We left that night." Rage, hot and immediate, surged through Caleb at the thought of someone hurting this child with cruel words, making him feel less than worthy because of circumstances beyond his control. "That woman was wrong," he said, forcing his voice to stay level. "You're not anything bad. You're my son, and anyone who says different will answer to me." Jonah absorbed this, then nodded with the gravity of someone accepting a fundamental truth. They worked in companionable silence after that, and Caleb marveled at how natural it felt, teaching this boy, sharing knowledge accumulated over years of hard work, watching small hands learn to mimic his movements with increasing confidence. The week passed in a blur of preparation. May washed and mended their best clothes, such as they were. Caleb rode out to check the far pastures one last time before they'd be gone for a day, wanting to ensure the cattle were settled and the fences secure. Jonah helped where he could, his excitement about the upcoming trip making him more talkative than usual, filling the house with chatter about what town would be like, what a wedding meant, what it would feel like to have a proper family. The night before they were to leave, after Jonah had finally been convinced to sleep, Caleb found May on the porch again, wrapped in her shawl against the autumn chill. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by cloud or human light, and the silence of the Montana night pressed close around them. "Having second thoughts?" Caleb asked, settling beside her on the step. May shook her head. "No, just thinking about how strange life is. A month ago, I was in Billings working in a kitchen, barely making enough to keep us fed and sheltered, certain that was all I'd ever manage. And now—" She gestured at the ranch, the house, the dark shapes of the barn and pasture. "Now I'm about to marry a man I barely know, on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, and somehow it feels more right than anything I've done in years." "You know me better than you think," Caleb said. "You know I keep my promises. You know I'll work myself to dust for this place and everyone on it. You know I'm not easy or comfortable with feelings, but I'm honest. That's more than a lot of marriages start with." "It is," May agreed. "And you know I'm stubborn and independent and terrible at asking for help. You know I'll fight you when I think you're wrong, and I won't be some meek wife who just agrees with everything you say." "Good," Caleb said, echoing his earlier sentiment. "I don't want meek. I want a partner who will tell me when I'm being foolish." May smiled slightly, then sobered. "What about the other parts of marriage? We haven't talked about—" She stopped, clearly uncomfortable. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," Caleb said carefully. "We'll take it slow, let things develop naturally. No expectations, no pressure. When you're ready for more than just legal partnership, you tell me. Until then, we focus on building what we've got. The relief in May's expression was visible even in starlight. Thank you. I need time, need to trust this is real before I understand. And Caleb did understand more than he could easily articulate. They were both carrying damage from their pasts, both learning to believe in the possibility of something lasting. Rushing intimacy would only strain what they were trying to build. They sat in comfortable silence after that, and Caleb thought about the strange journey that had brought them here. His years of running, May's years of survival, the child sleeping inside who'd been created in one brief intersection of their lives, and who now served as the anchor pulling them back together. It felt like fate, though Caleb wasn't sure he believed in such things. More likely it was just the messy reality of human lives colliding and creating consequences that demanded response. But whether fate or chance, the result was the same. Tomorrow they'd go to town and make official what had already become true in the weeks since May's arrival. They were a family, bound not just by blood, but by choice, by the decision to stop running and start building something that might last. The morning dawned cold and clear, frost silvering the grass and their breath visible in plumes as they loaded into the wagon. May wore her best dress, dark green fabric she must have saved for years, and she'd done something different with her hair, softer around her face than the severe bun she usually favored. Jonah was scrubbed cleaner than Caleb had ever seen him, his excitement making him bounce on the wagon seat. The ride to town passed quickly, Jonah's chatter filling the time, and when Ridgemont came into view, Caleb felt his stomach tighten with nerves he hadn't expected. This was real now, no longer something they'd discussed in the privacy of the ranch, but a public declaration that would be recorded and witnessed and permanent. They went straight to the church, a small white building at the end of Main Street. Reverend Williams was an elderly man with kind eyes and a practical approach to frontier religion that Caleb appreciated. He listened to their request without judgment, asked a few questions to ensure they understood the commitment they were making, then nodded his acceptance. "I can perform the ceremony this afternoon if you'd like," Williams said. "We'll need witnesses. I can ask Mrs. Morton and Sheriff Thomas if they're available." "That would be fine," May said, her voice steady despite the tension Caleb could see in her shoulders. They spent the intervening hours at the general store, May selecting a few items they'd need for the coming months, while Caleb arranged for the witnesses. Mrs. Morton agreed immediately, her expression softer than Caleb had expected, and Sheriff Thomas nodded his approval, clearly pleased they'd taken his earlier suggestion to heart. At 3 o'clock, they gathered in the small church. Jonah stood between them, one hand in May's, one in Caleb's, as Reverend Williams read through the traditional words with measured dignity. The ceremony was simple, no music or flowers or elaborate ritual, just the essential promises spoken clearly and witnessed properly. When Williams asked if Caleb would take May as his lawful wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, Caleb answered without hesitation, "I will." And when May was asked the same, she looked at Caleb directly, her voice clear and certain. "I will." Williams pronounced them married, suggested Caleb might kiss his bride, and Caleb leaned forward to press a chaste kiss to May's lips, brief and respectful. A promise sealed, but not yet fully claimed. May's eyes were bright when he pulled back, and her hand tightened in his. "Congratulations, Mrs. Morton said warmly, embracing May with unexpected affection. "You've got yourself a good man, even if he is stubborn as Missouri mules." Sheriff Thomas shook Caleb's hand with a firm grip. "Glad to see it done proper. The boy deserves it." They signed the necessary papers, Williams providing the official record that would be filed with the county, and suddenly it was done. May was May Ridgway, Jonah was Jonah Ridgway, and Caleb had a family he'd never planned for but now couldn't imagine living without. On the ride home, as evening settled over the territory and the first stars appeared, Jonah fell asleep against May's side, exhausted by excitement and the gravity of the day. May looked down at their son, Caleb reminded himself, with such tenderness it made Caleb's chest ache. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. May looked at him, and in the fading light, her expression was open in a way he'd never seen it. "None. You?" "None," Caleb echoed, and meant it completely. They arrived home as full dark settled, and Caleb helped May down from the wagon while Jonah stirred sleepily. The house waited for them, lamplight warming the windows from the fire May had banked before they left, and it struck Caleb how different it looked now. Not just a building, but a home, a place where a family lived and worked and belonged. That night, after Jonah had been tucked into bed and May had changed from her good dress into her everyday clothes, they stood in the main room and confronted the practical reality they'd been avoiding: sleeping arrangements. The bedroom that had been May and Jonah's was now meant for the married couple, while Jonah would need his own space. "The loft," Caleb suggested. "I can make it comfortable for him. He'd probably like being up there, having his own private space." "Are you sure?" May asked. "It's been your room for years." "And now I have a wife," Caleb said, the words still strange on his tongue. "Seems appropriate we have the bedroom. I'll move Jonah's things up tomorrow, make it special for him." May nodded, but when they stood at the bedroom threshold, uncertainty clouded her face. Caleb remembered his promise, his commitment to let her set the pace. "I can sleep on the floor," he offered. "Give you privacy until you're comfortable." "No," May said, surprising him. "We're married. We should at least share the room properly. She trailed off, vulnerability showing through her careful armor. "Just sleeping," Caleb finished for her. "No expectations beyond that." Relief flooded her expression, and she nodded gratefully. They prepared for bed with awkward efficiency, Caleb turning his back while May changed, May doing the same for him. When they finally lay down, the bed that had seemed adequate for one person felt impossibly small with two. They lay rigid on their respective sides, careful not to touch, and the silence stretched uncomfortable and strange. Finally, May spoke into the darkness. "Thank you. For today. For making Jonah legitimate. For giving us your name and your protection." "You don't have to thank me for doing what's right," Caleb said. "That boy deserves everything I can give him. You both do. Still, it matters." May shifted, and Caleb felt the mattress move with her. "I know this isn't what you wanted for your life. I know we've disrupted everything you built here. You haven't disrupted anything. Caleb searched for words. "You've made it mean something. This place was just a location before, just work and survival. Now it's home. That's because of you." He heard May's breath catch, and then, hesitantly, he felt her hand find his in the darkness. Her fingers were small and work-roughened, but her grip was steady, and Caleb held on carefully, understanding this small gesture of trust for the gift it was. They fell asleep like that, hands linked between them, two people learning to build a life together one careful step at a time. The weeks that followed established new rhythms. Caleb converted the loft into a proper sleeping space for Jonah, building a sturdy bed frame and hanging curtains for privacy. The boy was thrilled with his elevated room, declaring it better than any place he'd ever slept, and took pride in keeping it organized and clean. May and Caleb navigated the intimacy of shared space with careful respect. They learned each other's morning routines, the small habits and preferences that define daily life. May discovered Caleb liked his coffee strong enough to strip paint and preferred silence for the first hour after waking. Caleb learned May hummed while she worked and had a tendency to rearrange furniture when she was thinking through problems. The first snow came in early November, 3 inches overnight, that transformed the ranch into something pristine and magical. Jonah woke to it with childish delight, having never seen so much snow at once, and Caleb spent the morning showing him how to build proper snowballs, how to read tracks animals left in fresh powder, how to move through drifts without exhausting yourself. May watched from the window, and when Caleb caught her eye, she was smiling with unguarded happiness that made her look years younger. That evening, she moved closer to him in bed, not quite touching, but no longer maintaining rigid distance, and Caleb took it as the sign of growing trust it was. Winter closed in properly after that, snow piling higher, temperatures dropping until breath froze in the air, and cattle huddled in sheltered areas seeking protection from brutal winds. The ranch became an island, cut off from town by impassable roads, and the three of them settled into the forced intimacy of people who had only each other for company. But where Caleb had once dreaded such isolation, he now found unexpected comfort in it. Evenings were spent teaching Jonah to read using the few books Caleb owned, or listening to May tell stories from her childhood in Missouri, or working together on projects that would wait until spring, mending tack, planning garden layouts, discussing improvements they might make when weather permitted. One night, deep in January with wind howling outside and snow piled to the windowsills, Caleb woke to find May crying quietly beside him. He touched her shoulder carefully, uncertain, and she turned into him with a sob that seemed torn from somewhere deep. "May, what's wrong?" He held her awkwardly, unpracticed at comfort, but trying. "Nothing's wrong," she managed between tears. "That's what's wrong. I'm happy. We're safe and warm, and Jonah's thriving, and you're exactly who you promised to be. I keep waiting for it to fall apart, for something to go wrong, and it just doesn't. I don't know how to stop waiting for disaster." Caleb understood that feeling, the inability to trust in good things lasting. "It's not going to fall apart," he said into her hair. "We're building something solid, May. Something that'll weather whatever comes." She cried harder at that, and Caleb just held her, letting her release years of fear and vigilance and the exhausting work of survival. When she finally quieted, she didn't pull away, and Caleb realized this was the first time they'd truly embraced, the first time she'd allowed herself to be vulnerable in his arms. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I don't usually—" "Don't apologize. You're allowed to feel things, allowed to be scared and happy at the same time." Caleb's hand moved in slow circles on her back, soothing. "We'll get through this together. All of it. The fear, the happiness, the hard work, the good days and bad. Together." May lifted her face to his then, and in the dim light from the banked fire, her expression held something new, not just trust but want, the careful opening of a door she'd kept firmly closed. When she kissed him, it was different from their wedding kiss, deeper and more certain, acclaiming as much as an offering. Caleb responded carefully, letting her set the pace, and when she pulled back, both of them breathing harder, she whispered, "I'm ready, if you are, to make this a real marriage in every way." "Are you sure?" Caleb needed her to be certain, needed this to be her choice, not something she felt obligated to give. "I'm sure," May said, and kissed him again with conviction that erased any doubt. What followed was tender and careful, two people learning each other with patience and care, creating intimacy not from passion alone but from trust built slowly over months of shared life and steady presence. Afterward, May curled against Caleb's side, her head on his shoulder, and the rightness of it, the complete sense of belonging, made Caleb's throat tight with emotion he didn't have words for. "I love you," May whispered into the darkness. "I didn't plan to, tried not to, but I do." Caleb had never said those words to anyone, had spent years believing he wasn't capable of the feeling they represented. But lying there with May's warmth against him, with his son sleeping in the loft above, with the life they'd built surrounding him in the form of this house and this land and this fragile, precious connection, he found the words came easier than expected. "I love you too," he said, and meant it with his whole being. "You and Jonah both. You're my family now, my home." May's arm tightened around him, and they lay together while winter raged outside, protected by walls they'd made into shelter, warmed by fire they kept burning together, bound by promises they were learning to keep one day at a time. The winter that had seemed endless finally began to break in late March, snow melting into rushing streams that carved temporary rivers through the pastures, mud replacing ice as the primary obstacle to movement. Caleb worked from dawn until dark repairing winter damage, fences knocked down by drifts, a section of barn roof that needed patching, cattle that required checking after months of harsh weather. May emerged from the house into lengthening daylight with renewed energy, already planning the garden she'd plant, talking about chickens that would need new coops, discussing improvements they could make now that they'd survived their first winter as a family. Jonah shadowed Caleb constantly, growing taller and more capable, his small hands learning to grip tools properly, his questions evolving from simple curiosity to genuine understanding of ranch work. One morning in early April, Caleb was replacing fence posts when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. He straightened, hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he kept nearby, then relaxed as he recognized Sheriff Thomas riding up the muddy track toward the house. Caleb walked to meet him, wariness prickling despite Thomas's generally fair nature. Lawmen didn't typically make social calls to isolated ranches, and the sheriff's expression carried a seriousness that suggested this wasn't just a neighborly visit. "Thomas," Caleb greeted him. "What brings you out this way?" The sheriff dismounted, nodded toward the house where May had appeared in the doorway, Jonah peeking out from behind her skirts. "Need to speak with you both, actually. Mind if we go inside? This might take a bit." Caleb's stomach tightened, but he gestured toward the house. May's face had gone carefully neutral as they approached, and she stepped back to let them enter, immediately moving to put coffee on while Thomas settled at the table with the air of a man carrying unwelcome news. "I'll get straight to it," Thomas said once they were all seated, Jonah having been sent to the loft with instructions to stay quiet. "There's been questions raised in town about your marriage, about the boy, about the circumstances of how this all came together." "What kind of questions?" May's voice was tight, controlled. "We were married properly, with witnesses. Everything's legal." "Oh, it's all legal," Thomas assured her. "That's not the issue. The issue is Hewitt's been running his mouth, suggesting things that aren't true but that make for ugly gossip. Says the marriage was forced, that you were trapped into it, that maybe Ridgway here coerced you into staying by threatening to take the boy." Caleb felt rage surge hot and immediate. "That's a damned lie. May came here of her own free will, stays of her own free will. I know," Thomas interrupted, holding up a hand. "I know it's not true. Anyone who's seen you three together knows it's not true. But Hewitt's got some people stirred up, and there's talk of bringing in someone from the territorial office to investigate, make sure there's no impropriety happening out here." May had gone pale, her hands clenched together on the table. What would an investigation mean? Questions, mostly. They'd want to interview you separately, make sure you're here voluntarily, that the boy's being properly cared for. It's mostly formality, but it's invasive, and it puts your private business on public display. Thomas looked genuinely apologetic. "I wanted to warn you before anyone official showed up, give you time to prepare." "We have nothing to hide," Caleb said flatly. "They can ask whatever they want. May will tell them the same thing I will. We're married, we're raising our son, and what happens on this ranch is nobody's business but ours." "There's another option," Thomas said carefully. "Hewitt's the one pushing this, nursing some grudge against you that goes back years, Caleb. If someone were to address his concerns directly, convince him to drop it, the whole thing might fade away before any official inquiry happens." "Oh, you mean pay him off," Caleb said, disgusted. "Give him money to shut his mouth." "I mean talk to him, man to man. Make him understand there's nothing to investigate and that pursuing this only makes him look petty." Thomas met Caleb's gaze steadily. "I can't do it. I'm the law. I have to stay neutral. But as a neighbor, as someone who'd like to see this settled quietly, I'm suggesting it might be worth trying." May spoke then, her voice low but steady. "I'll go. I'll talk to him myself, tell him the truth of how we came together, make him understand there's no story here worth pursuing." "May, no," Caleb started, but she cut him off. "Yes, this started because of me and Jonah, because people like Hewitt think they have the right to judge choices they know nothing about. I won't hide behind you, won't let you fight battles that are mine to face." "They're ours to face," Caleb corrected firmly. "We're married. That means we handle this together." Thomas stood, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion in the room. "I've said my piece. However you choose to address it is your business. Just know you've got maybe a week before this moves beyond local gossip into official channels." He nodded to May. "Mrs. Ridgway, Caleb, I hope this resolves peacefully." After the sheriff left, Caleb and May sat in tense silence, the specter of outside interference poisoning the peace they'd built. Finally, May spoke. "We should go to town. Talk to Hewitt, to anyone else who has questions. Face this directly instead of waiting for it to come to us." "I don't want you subjected to that man's judgment," Caleb said harshly. "You shouldn't have to defend yourself to someone like him." "I've defended myself to worse," May replied with quiet steel. "I survived 5 years of judgment and gossip and people treating my son like he was shameful. I can handle one bitter rancher with too much time on his hands." Caleb studied her face, seeing the determination there, the refusal to be cowed or hidden. "All right," he said finally, "we'll go together. Tomorrow. We'll tell our story to whoever wants to hear it, and if Hewitt still wants to pursue this after that, then let him. We've got nothing to hide." That evening, they explained to Jonah that they'd be going to town the next day, that there might be some difficult conversations, but that everything would be fine. The boy listened with the wariness of someone who'd learned that adult assurances didn't always hold true, but he nodded acceptance and retreated to his loft without his usual chatter. The ride to Ridgemont the next morning felt longer than usual, tension thick between Caleb and May despite their united front. They left Jonah with Mrs. Morton, who'd agreed to watch him for a few hours, and then faced the task of finding Hewitt. They located him at the saloon, already drinking despite the early hour, and Caleb felt May stiffen beside him as they entered the dim, smoke-filled space. Hewitt looked up as they approached, and something ugly crossed his face. "Well now," he drawled, "if it isn't the happy couple. Come to discuss your domestic arrangements?" "We've come to address the lies you've been spreading," Caleb said evenly, fighting to keep his temper in check, "and to give you a chance to hear the truth before you embarrass yourself further." Hewitt's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, May stepped forward. "My name is May Ridgway," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the suddenly quiet saloon. "I came to Montana of my own free will, answered an advertisement for honest work, and discovered the man hiring was someone I'd known briefly years before. He's the father of my son, yes. That's not a secret, and it's not something either of us are ashamed of. When he asked me to marry him, I said yes because I wanted to, because he'd proven himself to be a good man and a good father. Nobody forced me. Nobody coerced me. I married Caleb Ridgway because I chose him, and I stay on his ranch because it's my home." The simple dignity of her words seemed to ripple through the room, and Caleb saw several men shifting uncomfortably, suddenly interested in their drinks, rather than the confrontation unfolding. "Easy enough to say when he's standing right there," Hewitt sneered, though his confidence had wavered slightly. "How do we know you're not just saying what he wants to hear?" "Because I'm looking you in the eye when I say it," May replied, stepping closer to Hewitt with fearless directness. "Because I've survived worse than your judgment and your gossip, and I'm not afraid of either. My son is legitimate now, carries his father's name, and will inherit that ranch when the time comes. That bothers you for some reason I can't fathom, but your feelings about it don't change facts. We're a family, we're legal, and what happens in our home is none of your concern." "She's told you the truth," Caleb added, moving to stand beside May, presenting a united front. "You want to investigate us, go ahead. You'll find a legal marriage, a child being raised properly, and a ranch being worked honestly. The only thing you'll accomplish is making yourself look like a man who can't stand to see others building something good." Hewitt's face had gone red, and for a moment Caleb thought he might escalate into violence. But then Sheriff Thomas's voice came from the doorway. "Seems like a reasonable explanation to me, Hewitt, unless you've got actual evidence of wrongdoing rather than just speculation and spite." The rancher's jaw worked, but he seemed to recognize he'd lost whatever support he might have had. "Fine," he spat finally. "Do what you want. I was just looking out for the territory's interests." "The territory's interests are just fine," Thomas said firmly. "And I think this matter's settled, wouldn't you say?" It wasn't a question, and Hewitt knew it. He threw back the rest of his drink and stalked out of the saloon without another word, leaving Caleb and May standing in the sudden quiet. The bartender, a man named Collins, who'd always been fair in his dealings, spoke up then. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Ridgway, most folks in town don't share Hewitt's views. You and your family are welcome here, same as anyone." May's shoulders sagged slightly with relief, and Caleb felt his own tension begin to ease. They left the saloon to find a small group had gathered outside, clearly having heard about the confrontation. Mrs. Morton stood among them, Jonah at her side, and the woman's expression was fierce with approval. "Well said, May Ridgway," she declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And anyone who has further questions about the character of this family can answer to me." She looked around at the gathered crowd with a challenging stare that dared contradiction. One by one, people nodded or murmured agreement, and Caleb realized that while Hewitt might have tried to stir up trouble, the community wasn't interested in participating. They'd seen May and Caleb in town, had witnessed their obvious commitment to each other and to Jonah, and whatever gossip might swirl, most people were decent enough to respect a family trying to build an honest life. On the ride home, With Jonah chattering about his time with Mrs. Morton and the peppermint stick she'd given him, May reached over and took Caleb's hand. He squeezed back, grateful for her strength, for the way she'd stood up in that saloon and claimed their life together with unwavering conviction. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you said in there, for defending us." "I was defending the truth," May replied. "And I meant every word. You're a good man, Caleb Ridgway, and I'm proud to be your wife." The simple declaration made Caleb's throat tight, and he brought her hand to his lips briefly, a gesture of affection he was still learning to make naturally. In the back of the wagon, Jonah hummed contentedly, secure in the knowledge that his family had faced a challenge and emerged intact. Spring advanced into summer, and the ranch thrived under their combined efforts. May's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables that transformed their meals. Caleb taught Jonah to ride on an old mare he acquired specifically for that purpose, and the boy's joy at mastering the skill was something fierce and beautiful to witness. The cattle fattened on summer grass, and Caleb's careful management began showing results in the quality of the herd. One evening in July, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson, Jonah asked a question that had clearly been building for a while. "Papa, when I'm grown, will the ranch really be mine?" Caleb looked at his son, seeing not the small boy who'd arrived uncertain and afraid, but someone growing into confidence and capability. "Yes. This land will be yours to work and yours to pass on to your children someday. That's what family legacy means." "What if I'm not good enough at it? What if I can't do it as well as you?" The vulnerability in that question reminded Caleb of his own fears, his own doubts about measuring up to his father's expectations. "You'll do it differently than me," he said carefully. "You'll have your own way of working the land, your own ideas about what makes a good ranch. That's not better or worse, just yours. And I'll teach you everything I know so you've got the foundation to build on. Will you teach me now? Everything, I mean, not just little pieces." Caleb met May's eyes, saw her gentle nod of encouragement. "All right, starting tomorrow, you work alongside me properly. Full days, real work, learning everything from cattle management to bookkeeping. If you're going to inherit this place, you need to understand all of it." Jonah's face lit up with pride and determination. "I won't let you down, Papa. I promise." "You couldn't disappoint me if you tried," Caleb said, and meant it absolutely. "You're my son, Jonah. That's enough all by itself." The years that followed weren't always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle lost to disease, and fences that needed constant mending. The endless cycle of work that defined ranch life. But they faced each challenge together, their family unit growing stronger through shared hardship and shared triumph. Jonah grew tall and capable, his resemblance to Caleb becoming more pronounced with each passing year. He learned the ranch with the dedication of someone who understood he was being entrusted with something precious, and Caleb watched with quiet pride as his son developed the skills and judgment that would serve him well when the time came to manage the land independently. May transformed the house into a true home, adding touches of comfort and beauty that made the rough structure feel welcoming. She became known in Ridgemont for her practical wisdom and her quiet strength, and other women sought her counsel on everything from cooking to child-rearing to navigating the complexities of frontier life. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Caleb woke to find May already up, standing at the window watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and amber. He joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against him with the comfortable ease of long familiarity. 5 years? She murmured. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, sometimes like yesterday. Any regrets? Caleb asked, though he knew the answer. Not a single one. May turned in his arms to face him. You gave me and Jonah everything I'd stopped believing we could have. Safety, belonging, a future worth building toward. How could I regret that? I got the better end of this bargain, Caleb said seriously. You took a broken man living in isolation and gave him a reason to be whole again, gave him a family, a purpose, a home that means something beyond just walls and land. They kissed, slow and deep, years of trust and affection and hard-won intimacy in that connection. When they finally pulled apart, May smiled with the contentment of someone who'd found exactly where they belonged. Jonah wants to start learning the books, she said, returning to practical matters. Says if he's going to run this place someday, He needs to understand the money side of things. He's right. He's got a good head for figures, takes after you in that. Caleb had learned that May possessed a sharp mind for numbers and had gradually turned over much of the ranch's bookkeeping to her capable management. He takes after both of us, May corrected. Your stubbornness, my practicality, his own particular blend of both. He's going to be fine, Caleb, better than fine. He's going to be the kind of man who makes us proud. He already does, Caleb said quietly. Every single day. They stood together watching the sun climb higher, burning off the morning mist that clung to the pastures, and Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first awkward afternoon when May stepped off the stagecoach carrying a child he hadn't known existed, through the careful negotiation of trust and commitment, through the challenges of building a life together from fractured pieces of separate pasts, they'd created something solid and lasting. It hadn't been easy. There'd been arguments and misunderstandings, moments of doubt and fear, times when the weight of responsibility felt crushing. But they'd persisted, choosing each other again and again, building their family one decision at a time, one kept promise layered upon another, until the foundation was strong enough to support whatever came. Later that morning, Caleb worked in the barn repairing tack while Jonah helped, the boy's hands now almost as capable as his father's. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from years of working side by side, until Jonah spoke up. Papa, did you ever think your life would turn out like this? With Mama and me, I mean. Caleb considered the question seriously. No, I spent years running from exactly this kind of connection, convinced I was better off alone. I was wrong. What changed? You showed up, Caleb said simply. You and your mama. And I had to choose between staying comfortable in my isolation or taking a chance on something that scared me. Turned out the scary choice was the right one. Jonah absorbed this, then asked, Are you happy, Papa? Really happy? The question was asked with such earnest hope that Caleb set down his tools and gave his son his full attention. Yes, Jonah. I'm happier than I've ever been. Your mama, you, this life we've built. It's everything I didn't know I needed. Every single day, I'm grateful you both came into my life. Jonah's smile was brilliant, uncomplicated joy at his father's contentment, and Caleb felt his heart swell with love for this boy who'd given him purpose and taught him that strength came not from isolation, but from connection, from showing up for people who depended on you, from building something that would outlast your own life. That evening, the three of them sat together on the porch as twilight deepened into night, watching stars emerge one by one in the vast Montana sky. May leaned against Caleb's shoulder while Jonah sprawled at their feet, pointing out constellations he'd learned to recognize. There's the Big Dipper, the boy said, and over there, that's Orion, the hunter. Your grandfather taught me those same stars, Caleb said, remembering evenings like this from his own childhood, before loss had taught him to guard his heart. Said they were like old friends, always there, even when everything else changed. They're still here, Jonah observed with the simple wisdom of youth, even though grandfather isn't. That's right, and someday when I'm gone, you'll look up and see these same stars. You'll remember nights like this, sitting with your mama and me, and you'll tell your own children about them. I'll tell them about you too, Jonah said seriously, about how you built this ranch, how you gave Mama and me a home, how you taught me everything important. Caleb had to clear his throat against the sudden tightness there. You do that. Keep the stories alive. That's how family persists, through the stories we tell, the lessons we pass down, the legacy we leave in the people who come after us. May's hand found his in the darkness, and they sat together in the quiet satisfaction of people who'd built something worth keeping, something that would endure long after they were gone. The ranch that had been Caleb's refuge from grief had become their shared foundation, the land that would sustain generations of Ridgeways who hadn't even been born yet. As the years continued their steady march, the rhythms of ranch life became the steady heartbeat of their family's existence. Jonah grew into a young man of 16, then 18, then 20, his competence with cattle and land management eventually matching and then exceeding Caleb's own. The boy who'd arrived uncertain and afraid had become someone solid and confident, someone who understood the value of honest work and the weight of responsibility. Caleb aged 2. his hair going gray, his movements slower but still capable, and he found satisfaction in watching Jonah take on more of the ranch's daily operation. It wasn't loss or displacement. It was the natural progression of legacy being honored, of a son stepping into the role he'd been prepared for through years of patient teaching and trust. May remained the steady center of their lives, her quiet strength the foundation they both depended on. She'd added a room to the house where she taught reading and writing to children from neighboring ranches, sharing the education she'd fought hard to acquire with the next generation. Her garden had expanded into something legendary in the area, and visiting ranchers' wives often sought her advice on everything from preserving food to navigating the complexities of frontier marriage. One autumn afternoon, 20 years after May had first stepped off that stagecoach, Caleb sat on the porch watching Jonah work with a young mare in the corral. His son moved with the patient confidence of someone who'd learned well, and Caleb felt profound contentment at the sight. May joined him, settling into the chair beside his with the comfortable ease of 2 decades together. "He's good with the horses," she observed. "Better than you ever were." "He is," Caleb agreed without offense. "He's better at most things. Smarter about money, more patient with difficult cattle, better at working with the neighboring ranchers. This place will thrive under his management." "He learned from the best," May said, taking Caleb's weathered hand in her own. "You gave him everything he needed to succeed." "We gave him everything," Caleb corrected. "You and me together. Neither of us could have done this alone." They sat in silence for a while, watching their son work, watching the sun lower toward mountains that had witnessed their entire journey together. Finally, May spoke the thought that had clearly been on her mind. "Do you ever think about that night in Billings? About how different our lives would be if we'd never met?" "Sometimes," Caleb admitted. "And I'm always grateful we did meet. Grateful that somehow, against all odds, we found our way back to each other." He squeezed her hand gently. "You saved me, May. From loneliness, from a life half-lived, from becoming someone bitter and isolated, you and Jonah, you made me whole." "You saved us too," May said softly. "Gave us safety, belonging, a future. Gave Jonah a father who showed him what strength and gentleness could look like together. We were lost, and you gave us a home." Caleb turned to look at her, seeing the woman who'd faced down gossip and judgment with quiet dignity, who'd built a life from almost nothing, who'd chosen him again and again even when easier paths existed. "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now after years of practice. "More than I knew I could love anyone. Thank you for taking a chance on a broken man with more rough edges than polish. Thank you for seeing past a desperate woman with a child and recognizing we were worth the trouble," May replied, tears brightening her eyes. "Thank you for being exactly who you promised to be every single day, for 20 years. They kissed, gentle and familiar, a connection worn smooth by time but no less meaningful for its comfort. When they pulled apart, Jonah was walking toward them, finished with his work, his smile easy and content as he joined his parents on the porch. "Good session with the mare," he reported, settling onto the steps. "She's coming along nicely." "You're doing fine work, son," Caleb said with genuine pride. "This ranch is in good hands." Jonah looked between his parents, something thoughtful in his expression. "I've been meaning to talk to you both about Sarah Miller." Sarah was the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a capable young woman who'd been helping Jonah with the books lately, and Caleb had noticed the way his son's face brightened whenever her name came up. "What about her?" May asked, though her smile suggested she already knew. "I'd like to court her properly. With your blessing, I mean. Eventually, if things go well, I'd like to ask her to marry me. To build a life here, raise a family on this land." Caleb felt emotion well up, pride and joy, and the bittersweet awareness that his son was embarking on the same journey he and May had taken, building a family and a future from hope and hard work and commitment to see things through. "You have our blessing," he said firmly, "and our support, whatever you need. If Sarah's the woman you've chosen, then welcome her to the family with everything you've got." "She reminds me of Mama," Jonah said, looking at May with affection. "Strong and smart and not afraid of hard work. I think you'd like her." "I already do," May assured him, "and I can't wait to welcome her into this family properly." They talked into the evening about Jonah's plans, about the future of the ranch, about the possibility of grandchildren who would carry the Ridgway name into the next generation. As darkness settled and stars emerged, Caleb felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that the legacy he and May had built would continue, that the family they'd created from broken pieces and second chances would endure. The ranch that had been his refuge had become their fortress, their sanctuary, their heritage. The woman who'd arrived as his cook had become his partner in every sense, the co-architect of a life worth living. And the boy who'd been a surprise, an unexpected responsibility, had become the son of his heart,